Some agreements are signed with pens, others are signed with power. The recent understanding between China and Canada belongs to the second kind. At first glance, it low oaks like a trade adjustment, tariffs eased, markets reopened, diplomatic language softened, headlines framed it as a reset. But beneath the surface, this is not simply about electric vehicles, agricultural exports, or market access. This is about positioning, about survival in a world where economic alignment is becoming as strategic as military alliances. For years, Canada and China stood on opposite sides of a growing geopolitical fault line. Arrests, sanctions, diplomatic freezes, and quiet retaliation turned what was once a pragmatic economic relationship into a cautious standoff. Trust collapsed, trade slowed, political dialogue became scripted and cold. Yet now, quietly and deliberately, both sides are stepping back into the same room. This shift did not happen because old disagreements vanished. It happened because the global system itself is changing. Canada is a country deeply integrated into the Western economic order, historically anchored to the United States for security, trade, and political alignment. But dependence has a cost. When supply chains fracture, when protectionism rises, when strategic competition reshapes markets, even close allies begin to feel vulnerable. China, on the other hand, is navigating a different kind of pressure. Western markets are becoming more restrictive. Technology barriers are rising. Strategic decoupling is no longer theoretical. In this environment, Beijing is searching for stability, access, and legitimacy beyond confrontation. This is where Canada enters the picture. For China, engaging Canada is not merely about trade volumes. It is about demonstrating that engagement with a G7 country is still possible, that economic cooperation with the West is not entirely closed, that the narrative of isolation is incomplete. For Canada, the calculation is equally pragmatic. China represents scale, demand, a market too large to ignore indefinitely. Diversification is no longer a policy slogan, it is an economic necessity. Over-reliance on a single partner, even a friendly one, exposes structural risk. So this agreement is not about friendship, it is about leverage. What emerges is a relationship defined not by trust, but by managed exposure, a controlled reopening, each side testing how much it can gain without giving up strategic ground. Economically, the incentives are obvious. Canadian agricultural exports regain access to a massive consumer base. Chinese manufacturers find a regulated but valuable entry point into a developed market. Supply chains rewire themselves not out of goodwill, but out of calculation. Politically, however, the balance is delicate. Canada cannot afford to alienate its traditional allies. China cannot afford to appear weak or dependent. Every move is weighed not just for economic impact, but for how it signals alignment in a fragmented world. This is why the agreement is narrow where it needs to be, flexible where it can be, and intentionally ambiguous where clarity would create backlash. It is cooperation without commitment, engagement without endorsement. And this is the future shape of many global relationships. As power becomes multipolar and uncertainty becomes permanent, countries are learning to operate in contradiction, to trade with rivals, to negotiate with competitors, to separate economics from ideology, at least on the surface, but separation is never complete. Because behind every tariff reduction lies a political calculation. Behind every market opening lies a strategic risk assessment. And behind every handshake lies the unspoken question of who benefits more when the balance eventually shifts. This agreement is not an endpoint. It is a probe, a test of how far economic pragmatism can stretch before political gravity pulls it back. And the answer to that question will not only shape the future of China and Canada, it will reveal how the global economic order itself is being rewritten. To understand where this relationship is heading, one must look beyond trade figures and into the architecture of foreign policy itself. For Canada, engaging China today is no longer about optimism. It is about risk management. Ottawa is attempting something delicate, maintaining alignment with Western security structures, while carving out enough economic autonomy to protect its own future. This is not defiance against allies, but adaptation to a harsher global reality. In the past, Canadian foreign policy could afford clarity. Friends were friends, rivals were rivals. But the world no longer rewards such simplicity. Economic shocks, supply chain disruptions, and strategic competition have forced middle powers like Canada to operate in gray zones. China fits into that gray zone. By reopening selective economic channels, Canada signals that it will not fully sever ties, even under pressure. At the same time, it keeps regulatory barriers, security reviews, and political distance firmly in place. This is engagement with guardrails. China understands this dynamic well. Beijing is not seeking emotional reconciliation. It is seeking functional access. In a global environment where doors are slowly closing, even a partially open gate matters. Canada offers something rare: credibility within the Western system combined with valuable natural resources, advanced logistics, and regulatory legitimacy. This makes the relationship transactional by design. China gains an opportunity to normalize trade with a G7 economy without challenging the entire Western bloc at once. Canada gains diversification without publicly redefining its alliances. Both sides preserve deniability, yet this balance exists under constant external pressure. The United States is the invisible third actor in this story. It does not need to speak loudly to shape outcomes. Its influence is structural. Canada's security, intelligence cooperation, and defense posture are deeply integrated with Washington. Any move toward China is automatically scrutinized through that lens. This forces Canada into careful choreography. Every economic opening must be framed as limited, technical, and reversible. Every agreement must avoid language that suggests strategic alignment. This is why economic cooperation expands, while political trust remains intentionally shallow. China, meanwhile, uses patience as a tool. Beijing knows that global power shifts do not require dramatic breaks. They require accumulation. Each trade deal, each reopened channel, each normalized exchange chips away at the narrative of isolation. The goal is not to replace the United States in Canada's strategic calculus, but to ensure it is no longer the only option. Economically, the consequences begin to ripple outward. Canadian producers, especially in agriculture and resource sectors, find renewed demand. This stabilizes domestic industries and creates political incentives to maintain the relationship. Jobs become tied to exports. Regions become dependent on access. Over time, economic exposure turns into quiet influence. On the Chinese side, access to Canadian markets provides more than revenue. It offers legitimacy. Entry into regulated, developed economies strengthens China's position globally, countering claims that its products and practices are unwelcome everywhere outside the global south. But economic interdependence is never neutral. With increased trade comes increased vulnerability. Canada becomes more exposed to sudden policy shifts from Beijing. China becomes more exposed to regulatory crackdowns and political intervention from Ottawa under Allied pressure. This creates a mutual hostage dynamic, where both sides benefit from stability but prepare for disruption. This is why neither side fully commits. Instead, they build redundancy. Canada continues strengthening ties with Europe, Southeast Asia, and domestic production. China expands outreach across Africa, Latin America, and alternative trade corridors. Cooperation exists, but dependence is deliberately capped. What emerges is a fragile equilibrium. Not cooperation rooted in trust, but coexistence shaped by necessity. A relationship that can expand quietly and contract quickly, depending on the global climate. The deeper question, however, lies beyond bilateral gains. This agreement reflects a broader transformation in the global economy. The era of clear blocks is fading. In its place, a system of overlapping interests is forming, where countries simultaneously hedge, compete, and cooperate. In such a world, economic decisions become instruments of power, market access becomes leverage, supply chains become pressure points, and trade agreements become strategic signals. China and Canada are not rewriting the global order alone, but they are adapting to it faster than many expect. Whether this adaptation leads to long-term stability or deeper fragmentation remains uncertain. What is certain is that neutrality is becoming harder to maintain, and economic pragmatism is replacing ideological clarity. This agreement is not a resolution of conflict. It is a pause, a recalibration, a recognition that in an unstable world, even rivals must sometimes sit at the same table. But pauses do not last forever, and when the global balance shifts again, the true cost and true value of this partnership will be revealed. To understand where this path leads, one must stop thinking in terms of optimism or pessimism and start thinking in scenarios. Because this relationship does not have a single future. It has multiple possible outcomes, each shaped by forces far larger than bilateral trade. In the most stable scenario, economic pragmatism continues to dominate. Trade volumes grow quietly. Political disagreements remain contained. Neither side attempts to weaponize the relationship. In this version of the future, Canada succeeds in diversifying its economic exposure without triggering retaliation from allies. China secures steady access to resources and markets without provoking a coordinated backlash. This would be a world of controlled tension and functional cooperation. Growth would not be explosive, but it would be consistent. Industries would adapt. Supply chains would stabilize. The relationship would remain transactional, predictable, and limited in scope. But this scenario depends on one fragile assumption, that global competition remains managed. If that assumption breaks, the equation changes rapidly. In a more volatile future, rising strategic rivalry forces countries to choose sides more explicitly. Economic relationships that once seemed technical become politicized. Trade becomes a tool of pressure rather than cooperation. In such a world, Canada faces a hard decision. Align fully with its security partners and risk economic retaliation, or attempt neutrality and risk political consequences. History suggests that when pressure intensifies, middle powers rarely escape unscathed. Choices are delayed but not avoided. For China, this scenario carries different risks. Access to Canadian markets could be curtailed suddenly. Regulatory scrutiny could tighten. Diplomatic friction could turn economic channels into liabilities. This is why Beijing treats every reopening as provisional. It plans for access, but prepares for closure. The most dangerous scenario, however, is not confrontation. It is miscalculation. Economic interdependence can create a false sense of security. When both sides assume the other cannot afford disruption, they may push boundaries further than intended. A policy decision, a security incident, or an external crisis could then trigger a reaction neither side fully anticipated. In that moment, the true leverage becomes visible, and leverage in this relationship is asymmetrical. China holds scale. It can redirect trade, absorb short-term shocks, and apply pressure selectively. Canada holds legitimacy. It operates within a regulatory and alliance framework that can mobilize collective response. Neither advantage is absolute. Both are conditional. This is what makes the relationship unstable yet persistent. From a broader perspective, this agreement reflects how power now operates in the global economy. Influence is no longer exercised solely through dominance, but through optionality. The ability to switch partners, reroute supply chains, and recalibrate exposure becomes a form of strength. Canada is seeking optionality. China is seeking resilience. Neither goal guarantees security, but both are rational responses to uncertainty. For observers and investors, the lesson is not to read this agreement as a signal of alignment or reconciliation. It is a signal of adaptation, a recognition that rigid positions are costly in a fluid system. The global economy is no longer moving toward integration or fragmentation alone. It is doing both at the same time. Countries are decoupling in sensitive areas while reconnecting in others. They are reducing risk while expanding opportunity. They are preparing for conflict while trading as if stability will endure. China and Canada are not exceptions to this trend. They are case studies. Their relationship shows how states navigate contradiction, how they balance pressure without collapse, how they pursue advantage without declaring intent. This agreement will not define the future on its own, but it will shape decisions. It will influence behavior. It will alter assumptions about what cooperation looks like in an era where certainty is gone. And perhaps that is the most important insight of all. The future will not be decided by grand alliances or dramatic breaks. It will be shaped by quiet adjustments, limited openings, calculated risks. Agreements like this one do not announce a new world order. They quietly prepare for it. In the end, the story of China and Canada is not a story of friendship. It is not a story of rivalry. It is a story of calculation, adaptation, and the subtle negotiation of risk. The agreement they reached serves as a mirror to the global economy itself, fragmented, uncertain, and deeply interconnected. It shows that influence is no longer exercised by dominance alone, but by the ability to remain flexible while maintaining leverage. Economic opportunities are pursued, but always with the implicit understanding that political realities can reverse gains overnight. For Canada, the benefits are tangible yet measured. Farmers regain access to massive markets, industries stabilize, and regional economies find lifelines in new trade flows. Jobs depend on exports. Local political incentives now align with continued engagement. Yet these gains come with invisible strings, exposure to a partner that may shift priorities based on broader geopolitical tensions. For China, the gains are strategic. Access to a regulated, developed economy enhances global legitimacy, while resources and market channels reinforce supply chains critical to future growth. But these benefits are contingent on Canada's willingness to continue engagement without being forced into decisive alignment with adversaries. The agreement is, therefore, a delicate dance. Each side tests the limits of cooperation without fully committing. Each side balances immediate gain against long-term risk. Each side remains aware that the global system is volatile and that alliances, markets, and influence are never static. What does this mean for the wider world? It means that we are entering an era where pragmatism often outweighs ideology. Countries hedge, diversify, and recalibrate constantly. Traditional blocks are being replaced by fluid networks of interdependence and calculated risk. Observers, investors, and policymakers must recognize that stability is provisional, that access is conditional, and that leverage is often hidden in the quiet mechanics of trade and diplomacy rather than in headlines or summits. For those watching from the financial lens, the takeaway is clear. Monitor the signals, understand the dependencies, and anticipate the vulnerabilities. Markets react not only to numbers, but to perceptions of risk, trust, and exposure. This agreement is a window into that reality. It is not a guarantee, nor a prediction. It is a guidepost for navigating complexity. Ultimately, the China-Canada deal exemplifies a new paradigm. one where survival and advantage are negotiated in the margins, where cooperation and competition coexist, and where every handshake carries the weight of calculated strategy. In a world where certainty has vanished, this is how nations write their future. Not with dramatic proclamations, not with grand declarations, but with quiet adjustments, careful openings, and an unwavering eye on leverage. And perhaps the most profound lesson of all is this: in a system defined by volatility, adaptability is the currency of power. Those who understand it will thrive. Those who ignore it will be left unprepared. China and Canada have, for now, chosen to trade flexibility for stability. The world watches, the markets respond, and the future, still unwritten, waits to reveal who will benefit and who will learn the cost of miscalculation.